Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, I'm going to talk about chapter 6, the macroeconomic perspective. So with this chapter, we start learning macroeconomy. So what we are going to learn in this chapter, we are going to talk about gross domestic product. This gross domestic product is used to measure the size of the economy. And then we will learn how to adjust nominal values to real values. And then we check a couple of figures to understand how real GDP changes over time. And then learn how to compare GDP among countries. And the last topic is we will talk about how well GDP measures the well-being of society. So you see a picture here. This picture is from Great Depression. At times, such as when many people have trouble making ends meet, it's easy to tell how the economy is doing. But at other times, when some are doing well and others are not, it's more difficult to make sure that the economy of a country is doing well or not. So before we understand how we measure the well-being of the country, let's talk about macroeconomic goals, framework, and policies. As you see, we have three macroeconomic goals. We want economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. And the models that we use to achieve these goals are aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we have two main streams of economic thinking using this aggregate demand and aggregate supply. One is Keynesian model and the other one is neoclassical model. The policy tools that we use to achieve goals are monetary policy and fiscal policy. So in the following chapters, we are going to learn all these goals, frameworks, and policy tools. So let's start with the definition of gross domestic product. As I said, gross domestic products is used to measure the size of the economy. And it's defined as the value of the output of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. And this statistics measures the size of a nation's overall economy. So the economy's GDP can be measured by either total dollar value of what consumers purchase in the economy or the total dollar value of what the country produces. So either you can check the total value of production or you can check the total value of expenditure, but they are the same because whatever is spent on expenditure is produced by the country. So who buys all of a country's production? Demand for production can be divided into four categories: consumer spending, households buy every month and spend their money; business spending, businesses also purchase equipment, tools in order to produce more; government spending on goods and services; and spending on net exports. Net exports is exports minus imports. Exports are the goods that we produce and foreigners buy. Imports are the goods that foreigners produce but we buy. So you can see the percentage of components of 2016 US GDP on demand side. Consumption is the highest component, and then next one is the government expenditure, and investment spending is 16.7%. Exports 11.8% and imports is 14.5%. Here you can see the components of GDP on the demand side. Consumption is about 2/3 of GDP, but it moves relatively little over time. Business investment hovers around 15% of GDP, but it increases and declines more than consumption. Government spending, on the other hand, on goods and services is around 20%. Now let's talk about exports and imports. Exports are added to the total demand for goods and services, while imports are subtracted. The reason is because GDP has a geographical proximity. So we want to calculate the total production which are produced inside the country. As you know, imports are produced outside the country, so they shouldn't be included in the GDP. If exports exceed imports, as in most of the 1960s and 1970s in the US economy, there is a trade surplus. But if imports exceed exports, as in recent years, then there is a trade deficit. The GDP net export component or trade balance is equal to the dollar value of exports, which is represented by X, minus the dollar value of imports, which is represented by M. So the trade balance is the gap between exports and imports. If this gap is positive, then we have a trade surplus. That means a country's exports are larger than its imports. If this gap is negative, then we have a trade deficit. That means a country's imports exceeds exports, calculated as imports minus exports. So based on the four components of demand, GDP can be measured as sum of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, plus exports minus imports. That's why we have a trade balance in the equation. And production can be divided into 5 main parts. Durable goods. These are the long-lasting goods like a car or refrigerator. Non-durable goods, short-lived goods like food and clothing. Services, product which is intangible, such as entertainment, healthcare, or education. Structures, building used as residence, factory, office building, retail store, or for other purposes. And also chain in inventories. What is an inventory? Good that has been produced but not yet been sold are also included in the production over a year. Every market transaction must have both a buyer and a seller, so GDP must be the same whether measured by what is demanded or what is produced. That's why we can use both approaches. We can look at total expenditure or we can look at total value of production, but at the end both should give you the same number. So percentage of components of GDP on production side, as you see, US is a service economy, 62.4% of the production side. And then we have the durable goods and then non-durable goods and then structures. And since inventory is very small, it's not included in this figure. Here we can see the types of production over the years. Services are the largest single component of total supply, representing over 60% of GDP. And it increases from 45% to 60% over the years. Durable and non-durable goods constitute the manufacturing sector, and they have declined from 45% of GDP in 1960s to about 30% in 2016. Non-durable goods used to be larger than durable goods, but in recent years, non-durable goods have been dropping to below the share of durable goods, which is less than 20% of GDP. Structures hover around 10% of GDP. The chain in inventories are not shown in the picture. So when we calculate GDP, we have to make sure we are not double counting any good or service. So for that reason, we need to understand the difference between final goods and services and intermediate goods. So what are final goods and services? These are output used directly for consumption, investment, government, and trade purposes. So these are the goods at the furthest stage of production at the end of a year. Intermediate goods, on the other hand, these are the goods provided to other businesses at an intermediate stage of production, not for final users. And they are excluded from GDP calculation. So just I want you to understand here why we do not include. First of all, let's think about Starbucks coffee, right? You pay $5 to buy Starbucks coffee. And when you buy the Starbucks coffee, the value of the milk that Starbucks uses to make this coffee is included in the price. So there is the milk value. This is purchased by Starbucks, right? You may think that this is business spending, but we shouldn't count the value of milk that Starbucks purchases, let's say from Kroger. The reason is because the value of the milk is already included in the price of the coffee. So in order to prevent double counting, we always include the value of final goods and services in GDP calculation, not the intermediate goods. In this example, milk is an intermediate good. So GDP, I'm repeating here one more time, GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a year. We have other ways to measure the economy's size. One way is gross national product. So what is the difference between GDP and GNP? It's very simple. GDP includes all production inside the United States, right? It has to be produced in the United States regardless of the nationality of the company. So if Honda produces cars in Texas, it has to be in GDP. But GNP does not have geographical proximity. GNP focuses on national part, right? So GNP calculates the production of Americans. So in that case, if Americans produce Apple iPhone in China, the value of the Apple iPhone should be included in GNP. So in that example, for instance, Honda producing in Texas shouldn't be in GNP because Honda is not an American company. So that's the main difference between GDP and GNP. Net national product is GNP minus the depreciation. So the next question is, what is depreciation? Depreciation is the process by which capital ages over time and therefore loses its value. Net national product can be further subdivided into national income, and national income includes all income earned, wages, profits, rent, and profit income. Now we come to the next point, understanding the difference between nominal and real values. So nominal value is the economic statistic actually announced at the time, not adjusted for inflation. Real value is adjusted for inflation. So real value is more important, and I can show you one example. Let's say this is island A, and this island A produces 100 oranges and then 100 cars in 23. And this country A again produces the same number, right? Oranges and 100 cars. This is 2024. Let's say in 2023, the price of orange is $1 and the car price is $10,000. So we have here $10,100 of GDP. And in 2024, let's say the orange price is double, but car prices are the same. So the GDP in 2024 is going to be 10,200. But as you see here, you might say the income of the country A increases from 23 to 24. But when you look at these numbers, there is no increase in production. But production is important for us. We want to know whether the country produces more, because when we have more goods and services, our standard of living increases. So in order to eliminate the price increases, we use constant prices to calculate both 23 and 24 GDP, and then we are talking about the real value. So the difference between nominal and real values, nominal value is not adjusted for inflation, uses current prices. Real value is adjusted for inflation and uses constant prices. So let's see how we are going to use these concepts in calculating nominal GDP. Here you can see prices of pizza and chocolate over the years. And now let's calculate the nominal GDP in 2021. What I'm going to do is I need to find the value of total production in 2021. So I take 15 and multiply this by 300, which the value we create by producing pizza, and then take the price 2.5 and then quantity 1000. So therefore, if you sum these two values, we get the nominal GDP of 2021. And we can do the same thing for 2022. We get the price 16 times 400 plus $3 for chocolate. 1,200 chocolates are produced, so the nominal GDP is 10,000. And 2023 is 17 times 500 plus 3.5 times 1,300, so it's $13,050. So these are the nominal GDPs, and I want you to see the increase in nominal GDP here from 7,000 to 10,000. Increase in nominal GDP is 42.9%. And the next one is 10,000 to 13,000, and the increase in nominal GDP is 30.5. So this is how we calculate nominal GDP. Now let's see how we calculate real GDP. And for real GDP, we have a base year. That means we need to keep the prices constant, and the year that we use the prices to calculate real GDP over time is called base year. And in this example, base year is 2021. So that means prices do not change. Always the pizza price is going to be $15, whether you're in 2022 or you're in 2023. And the same is true for chocolate. So let's calculate the real GDP for 2021. We are going to use base year prices, which are 2021 prices. So it's $15 times 300 plus 2.5 times 1,000, 7,000. In 2022, things will change. This is not going to be the same as nominal GDP. As you see, prices now are constant, $15. I'm not changing the pizza price, but quantities are changing because I want to know if you produce more and what is this value of production. And here the prices of chocolate doesn't change as well, and real GDP is 9,000. 2023, again, the prices are constant for pizza and chocolate, and the real GDP is 10,750. When we look at the increase in real GDP, it's not as much as the nominal GDP, right? The increase is 28.6%. The reason is because we keep the prices constant, only the increase comes from the production. Increase in real GDP from 2022 to 2023, it's 19.4. Again, compared to nominal GDP is much lower. So the change in nominal GDP reflects both changes in prices and quantities. That's why we have these higher percentage rates in nominal GDP. But the change in real GDP is the amount that GDP would change if prices were constant. So therefore, change in real GDP reflects only changes in quantities. Hence, real GDP is corrected for inflation. Another important statistics that you need to know is GDP deflator. GDP deflator is nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So why we use GDP deflator? GDP deflator measures the price level, measures the current level of prices relative to the level of prices in the base year. And we use GDP deflator to calculate economy's inflation rate. So inflation rate is a growth rate, so it's a growth rate in percentage, and compute the percentage increase in the GDP deflator from one year to the next year gives us the inflation rate in year 2. So inflation rate in year 2 is GDP deflator in year 2 minus GDP deflator in year 1 divided by GDP deflator in year 1 times 100. Let's calculate the GDP deflator and then the inflation rate. So remember that GDP deflator is 100 times nominal divided real GDP, and always for the base year GDP deflator is 100 because for base year nominal GDP equals real GDP, therefore we get 100. For 2022 it's going to be different because nominal GDP is 10,000 divided by real GDP 9,000 times 100 is 111.1. And for 2023, it's nominal divided by real again, and it's 121.4. These are not percentages, these are just numbers. Now let's use these numbers, GDP deflator, and calculate the inflation. So how do we calculate 11.1%? Let's do it together. So we want to know the inflation rate in 2022. So I'm taking the GDP deflator in year 2, which is the last period, 2022. 111.1 minus the previous year's GDP deflator, 100, divided by previous year's GDP deflator times 100. So this difference is 11.1 divided by 100 times 100, you will see 11.1%. So the inflation rate is 11.1%. And you can use this formula and calculate 2023 inflation rate. So here is one example. Let's calculate quickly A and B. Compute the nominal GDP in 2021. In order to calculate the nominal GDP in 2021, I need to check here. This is 2021, right? Prices and quantities in 2021. So I'll take $1 times 100 plus $900 times 185. This is how you calculate the nominal GDP. So let's calculate real GDP in 2022. So for 2022, if I want to calculate the real GDP, I'm not using these prices. I'm using the base year prices. Therefore, it's going to be $1 times 1,000. The quantities are from 2022 plus 900 times 200. This is how we calculate the real GDP in 2022. GDP deflator in 2023, so you can do that as an exercise. You will find the nominal GDP in 2023 using 2023 prices and quantities. Then you will calculate real GDP in 2023 and then multiply this result by 100. So US nominal GDP have risen exponentially from 1960s through 2010. And the GDP deflator, which is a price index measuring the average prices of all goods and services, also rises from 1960s to 2010. So we have learned how to calculate real GDP given the quantities and prices, but there is an easy way that we can calculate real GDP, which we are using the GDP deflator equation. To calculate real GDP, you are going to take nominal GDP and divide that by price index. Here, price index is GDP deflator over 100. For simplicity, the price index is traditionally published after being multiplied by 100 in order to get an integer number. So don't forget to divide the published price index by 100 when you're calculating the real GDP. So let's use this formula to calculate the real GDP for 1960s. So 1960s, to calculate the real GDP, you take the nominal GDP. In that case, nominal GDP is 543.3 billion. And then you take the GDP deflator and plug it into denominator. Since this number is found by multiplying 100, you should divide by 100. And then you can calculate the real GDP. So let's do 2005, to make sure we understand how we calculate real GDP in 2005. Real GDP in 2005 is equal to nominal GDP divided by price index, and this price index should be divided by 100, which is equal to 1. So the real GDP is $13,095.4 billion. To calculate the real GDP in 2010, you are going to take the nominal GDP in 2010, take the price index, divide by 100, and that's how you calculate the real GDP. As long as inflation is positive, real GDP should be less than nominal GDP in any year after the base year. So you can see here, real GDP after the base year is lower than the nominal GDP, but before the base year, it's higher than nominal GDP. So, and the next thing that we need to know is how to calculate the growth rate. So we want to know how much the real GDP changes from one year to another. This is important because that rate is going to show us the economic growth. Since it's a growth rate, the formula is always the same. Take the real GDP in the last period, subtract the real GDP in the previous period, divide by the real GDP of the previous period, and if you multiply this result by 100, you will find the percentage change. So in this case, real GDP in 2010 is this one, minus the real GDP in 1960s, divide this by 1960s and multiply the result by 100, and then you will find that the economy grows 376% since 1960. Governments report GDP growth as an annualized rate. When analyzing growth in a quarter, the calculated growth in real GDP for the quarter is multiplied by 4 when it's reported. So GDP, real GDP growth, let's say by quarter is 1%. Quarter refers to 3 months. And to find the annual growth rate, you multiply this by 4. And we have two terms that you need to know: recession, a significant decline in national output or GDP; depression, an especially lengthy and deep decline in output. Here you can see the real GDP and how it changed over the years. Real GDP in the United States in 2016 was about 16.7 trillion. After adjusting to remove the effects of inflation, this represents a roughly 20-fold increase in the economy's production of goods and services since the start of the 20th century. Other important terms you need to know about recessions and expansions. Peak represents the highest point of output before a recession begins. So the economy has cycles, and we say that when the economy shrinks, we call it recession. During the business cycle, so this is business cycle, we have ups and downs. And here the peak represents the highest point of output before a recession begins. Toro, during the business cycle, the lowest point is Toro. So this is Toro. And recession lasts from peak to Toro. So this is peak, this is Toro. And an upswing or boom runs from Toro to peak. So this is boom, this is recession. The next topic that we are going to learn how to compare GDP among countries. To compare the GDP of countries with different currencies, it's necessary to convert to a common denominator using an exchange rate. What is an exchange rate? Exchange rate is the value or price of one currency in terms of another currency. Here is one example. We want to compare Brazil's GDP in 2013 of 4.8 trillion reals with US GDP of $16.6 trillion for the same year. We can't compare real and dollars, so we need to use an exchange rate. And in 2013, the exchange rate was 2.157 reals per dollar. So when you give $1, you're getting back 2.157 reals. In order to convert Brazil's GDP into US dollars, you're going to take Brazil's GDP in reals and divide by exchange rate. Here in this case, 4.845 trillion reals divided by 2.157 reals per dollar. And then this number that you find is the Brazil's GDP in US dollars. Now we can compare the Brazil's GDP with US GDP. And as you see, US GDP was 16.6 trillion in 2013, which is nearly 8 times that of GDP in Brazil. And the next important term is GDP per capita. GDP per capita is calculated by GDP divided by population. So this is the total economic pie. And with GDP per capita, we find that if we divide this economic pie equally among the citizens of the country, then what is going to be the amount each gets? So GDP divided by population is GDP per capita. And this statistics is important to compare the country's economic progress or living standards internationally. And this is the last slide that we are going to talk about. So GDP is used to measure the size of the economy, but GDP is not the same as standard of living. What is standard of living? Standard of living includes all elements that affect people's happiness and well-being, whether they are bought or sold in the market or not. So GDP focuses on the goods that have market value. So GDP does not include the value of leisure time, actual levels of environmental cleanness, health, and learning, production that is not exchanged in the market, and the level of inequality in society, and what technology and products are available. So for that reason, GDP and standard of living differs, because standard of living includes everything in GDP plus the value of leisure time and the other bullet points listed here. So thank you for watching this video.